your work going? How's your work coming along? Remember last week was Labor Day weekend, and so last Sunday we asked the question, what is our work? That is, as followers of Jesus, what is the work that we have been given to do? Well, when we listened to Paul said that our work is to live our lives as a living sacrifice. Then when we turn to Jesus, Jesus said that our work is to lose our lives for His sake. Our work is to deny ourselves, to take up our cross and follow Jesus, to go where Jesus goes, to stand where Jesus stands, to be with those who are struggling, because that's where Jesus is. Those who are bearing the crosses of this world, regardless of whether those crosses are of their own making or not. So I'm just checking in and wondering, how's your work coming along? But I also have another question I want to ask you today. And it's related to the first. How many of you are getting paid to be here? How many of you are paid to be here? Well, in her book, Start Where You Are, A Guide to Compassionate Living, Emma Chodron tells a story about a Buddhist teacher named Gyurgyef, who lived in the early 20th century. Now, he lived outside of Paris on this large estate with these kind of massive lawns, and his students lived there with him in community. Now, Gyurgyef was one of these kind of crazy wisdom type of people. And so there's this story that is told about a man who once lived in the community. And this man had a really, really bad temper. And nobody could stand this guy because he was so prickly. Every little thing caused him to kind of spin off into a tantrum. You know, everything irritated him. And he complained about everything, so that everyone felt the need to kind of tiptoe around him, because anything that might be said might send him off and make him explode. Basically, they just wished he'd go away. Well, Gyurgyef liked to make his students do things that seemed absolutely meaningless. And so one day, there were about 50 of his students cutting up little parts of the lawn and just transporting them to other parts of the estate. Well, that was too much for this fellow. He just couldn't stand it. It was the last straw. So he blew up, stormed out, got in his car, and drove off. And there was spontaneous celebration and cheers. And the people were just absolutely thrilled and happy that he was gone. But when they told Gyurgyef what had happened, he's like, oh no. And he hopped in his car and he went after the guy. 3 days later, he returns with this gentleman. And that night, when Gyurgyef's attendant was serving him dinner, he said, "Sir, why did you bring him back?" And Gyurgyef answered in a very low voice. He said, "You're not going to believe this. And you gotta keep this between you and me. You can't tell anybody. But I paid him to stay here." And so I ask you again, how many of you are paid to be here? Why would anybody pay a man like this to be part of their community? Somebody who is irritable and irritated. Well, for the same reason why somebody might put a little grain of sand into an oyster to produce a pearl. When we live in community, we are constantly bumping into each other, which produces friction and heat. Now, of course, this isn't pleasant, and we would much rather avoid conflict. But the friction produced by living in community has great potential for smoothing out the rough edges of our personality and our egos. It's much like putting rocks in one of those tumbling rock polishers. Gyurgyef paid this man to be his irritating self so that others in the community might become pearls of mercy and compassion. Now, of course, there were no guarantees. Putting sand into an oyster doesn't always produce a pearl. But by the same token, no pearls are created without the irritating presence of grains of sand. Jesus is also interested in creating communities that can produce pearls of compassion. Christian communities in which people arrive as grains of sand and over time are transformed into treasures of mercy and compassion. Fact is, we've all been paid to be here. We have all been recruited and hired by God to be sandpaper for one another. We weren't chosen because we had such wonderful gifts to offer, even though that might be true. Rather, each of us was chosen by God. Each of us was paid by Jesus to be here, precisely because we are broken and sinful. And Jesus needs these sorts of people to do the work that He's wanting done in the world. You see, Jesus is in the business of recruiting and training people to work in the fields of forgiveness and reconciliation. But here's the rub. We can't develop the capacity, we can't develop the skill for forgiveness and reconciliation unless we're in a place where people are sinning against us. Unless we're invested in a community where our brothers and sisters are getting paid to step on our toes, to get into our space, and to transgress our boundaries. That's the sort of real-world environment we need if we're going to practice the art and science of forgiveness and reconciliation. So Jesus calls broken, sinful people into community with one another. People who don't share the same background, same worldview, same politics. And Jesus knows that this isn't easy, at least not all of the time. Jesus assumes that there's going to be conflict in the church. He assumes that we will rub each other wrong, that we will be a source of irritation to one another. Jesus knows that we will sin against our brothers and sisters. And so Jesus doesn't just throw us together and expect us to figure it out on our own. He offers guidance and direction as to how His followers are to navigate life in community with one another. Especially when sin enters the picture. I mean, Jesus knows that sin is deadly. He knows that sin destroys community because it infects relationships and it interferes with our sense of trust in one another. But it's not just the act of sin that does this. Sinning against our brothers and sisters does bring harm, both to those individuals and to the community as a whole. But honestly, if we're in community with other people, sinning, transgressing against our brothers and sisters is inevitable. It will happen. Sooner or later, despite our best efforts, we will sin against one another. And yet the good news is that sin doesn't have to have the last word. Sin doesn't have to end in death. Because through the grace of God, the wounds that sin inflicts can be healed. But only if we attend to them. Only if we administer forgiveness and reconciliation. But if we do nothing, either out of fear or resentment or self-preservation, then the wounds of sin can fester and can become cancerous. When we fail to address the hurts we cause, as well as the hurts that we receive, community begins to diminish, begins to die. Even when the hurts are small, if the wounds of sin are not cleaned and dressed with forgiveness and reconciliation, then sin will be able to work its destructive magic. we will become hesitant, unsure of one another, uneasy in one another's presence. Trust will erode and begin to be replaced by suspicion. And we'll begin to avoid one another. And slowly we'll drift apart. And the community will die. This is the situation that I think Jesus is seeking to address in today's teaching. His teaching on the proactive work of reconciliation. And honestly, much of what Jesus says today is uncomfortable, if not disturbing. I mean, most of us don't relish the idea of going to someone who has hurt us and pointing out their sin or pointing out their fault. We would much rather remain silent or go and talk with our friends about it. And certainly none of us wants to be in the business of kicking people out of the church, which it seems is where Jesus ends up at the end of the story. So what's going on? And how does what Jesus teach today, how does it fit in with other things that he's taught? I mean, back in Matthew chapter 6 in the Sermon on the Mount, didn't Jesus say, "Do not judge so that you might not be judged"? And didn't he go on to talk about the problem of pointing out specks of dust in other people's eyes, in the eyes of our neighbor, while we are sitting there sporting logs in our own eyes? So how are we to fit all of this together? How are we to best understand what Jesus is calling us to do today? I think one of the best ways is to listen to a story that Jesus tells right before today's reading. Now, it's a story that he tells in other contexts. But today it's important to realize that when Jesus tells this story, he's not talking to the crowds. He's talking to his own disciples. He's trying to teach them something about what it means to live in community with one another. And so he says, what do you think? What do you think? If a shepherd has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray, does the shepherd not leave the 99 on the mountains and go in search of that one who went astray? And if he finds it, truly I tell you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 that never went astray. And so, it is not the will of your Father in heaven that one of the least of these little ones should be lost. Now again, I want to stress the fact that in this particular context, Jesus isn't talking to the crowds. He's not talking to his opponents, but to his disciples. This is not a parable about evangelism, not a parable about radical hospitality. It's a parable about Christian community. And so the one sheep that goes astray isn't a tax collector or a sinner, but a member of the church who has committed a sin against another member. A member of the church who has committed a sin and become lost. Now the shepherd has plenty of sheep, yet the shepherd goes searching for this one lost sheep. Because as Jesus says, God doesn't want even one of these little ones to get lost or to stay lost. So this isn't about evangelism, it's about the proactive work of reconciliation. Because you see, the shepherd doesn't wait for the lost sheep to find its way home. When the shepherd discovers that one sheep is missing, the shepherd immediately begins searching. And I dare say that if the shepherd's initial search was in vain, came up empty, I dare say he would go and get other shepherds to join him. And this is what I think Jesus is talking about today. This is what Jesus is calling us to do as well. He says, if another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. If your brother or sister listens to you, you have regained that one. You have restored that one to the community. And that's the goal. The goal isn't to judge. The goal isn't to condemn. The goal is to be reconciled to one another. The goal is to make sure that sin, big sins, small sins, doesn't matter. The goal is to make sure that sin doesn't get in the way of our relationship with one another. That's the goal. Now, it may be, as Jesus says, that reconciliation doesn't happen right away. But we never give up. Sometimes it may take the intervention of 2 or 3 others. In some situations, it might take the intervention of the whole community. And unfortunately, in some extreme situations, Jesus says that the community may have to cut ties with a beloved brother or sister, at least for a time, because they have repeatedly refused to be reconciled. Now, I know that sounds disconcerting, and it'd be worth taking the time to explore it further, but we don't have time. But I think out of all of it, what we need to understand that even if such extreme measures might be called for in some given situation, the goal is never to exclude. The goal is always reconciliation motivated by love. I mean, we know that sometimes it takes a 2-by-4 upside the head, right? But that's not the first step. That's a last resort. And it must always be motivated by love. That's what Paul says in Romans 13. All the law can be summed up in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Love does no wrong to a brother or sister. And why is Jesus willing to go through even such extreme measures? It's because, again, it's God's desire that not even one person should get lost and stay lost. So what I think Jesus is saying in all of this difficult stuff is that love and compassion have no limits. In the words of Stanley Hauerwas, this is the kind of community that Jesus has called into existence. A people who are to love one another so intensely that they refuse to risk the loss of the one who has gone astray, or the loss of ourselves in harboring resentment. It's never an option to say, the 99 are here, let's forget about them. Love, compassion have no bounds. But this is hard work. This is why Jesus talks about taking up our cross and following Him, because it's hard work. But this is the work that we have been given to do. This is the work that God, through the gift of His Spirit, has paid us to do. The hard work of forgiveness and reconciliation in all situations.